Elias Vancroft had designed and built futures for cities that hadn't dreamed them yet. But on the morning he walked into the dying library on Ashford Street, he didn't know that a woman with ink-stained fingers and quiet defiance would become the only structure his hands could never hold, and the only foundation his heart would ever need. The penthouse apartment 43 floors above the city existed in perpetual twilight, all chrome and shadow, angles sharp enough to cut. Elias Vancroft preferred it that way. Clean lines, no sentiment, no photographs cluttering surfaces, no books spilling warmth across shelves, no evidence that a human heart beat within these walls, just blueprints. Endless blueprints. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with his morning coffee, studying the cityscape he'd helped create. 7 buildings bore his signature, reflecting his vision of progress. Efficient, modern, untouched by the softness of nostalgia. The Ashford Street Library renovation would be his 8th triumph. His assistant had briefed him yesterday. The building was an architectural relic from 1887, crumbling and obsolete, squatting on premium downtown real estate like a monument to wasted potential. The city council wanted it gutted and reborn, maintaining only the facade to appease preservationists, while transforming the interior into something useful. A digital hub, co-working spaces, revenue generating, Elias excelled at this kind of resurrection. He knew how to strip away the rot, the inefficiency, the emotional attachment people confused with value. He arrived at the library at 7:30, before the morning crowds, before the protests that would inevitably come. The building hunched between sleek office towers like an elderly relative at a family gathering, tolerated, but not celebrated. Limestone darkened by decades of exhaust, Gothic arches that seemed to sag under their own weight, windows that caught the morning light and held it like a secret. Inside, the air tasted of dust and time. Elias's footsteps echoed across marble that had been worn smooth by a century of feet. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadows. Rows of shelves stretched into dimness, patient and silent, waiting for the demolition crews he'd scheduled for next month. Mr. Vancroft? The voice emerged from somewhere deeper in the stacks, soft but clear, like a note played in an empty concert hall. Elias turned. She materialized from between shelves, and for a moment, backlit by a shaft of dusty light, she seemed less like a person, and more like something the building itself had conjured. Small-framed, drowning in an oversized cardigan the color of old paper, dark hair twisted carelessly at her nape, glasses that caught the light and hid her eyes. "Clara Hayes," she said, extending a hand. "Head archivist." Her fingers were cool and ink-stained when they touched his palm. The handshake lasted precisely 2 seconds. Professional? Unremarkable. Yet something about the contact made Elias aware of the weight of his own hand, the dryness of his skin, the irrational thought that he should have worn different cufflinks. He dismissed the thought immediately. "I wasn't expecting anyone here this early," he said, releasing her hand and stepping back to a more appropriate distance. "I'm cataloging before." She gestured vaguely at the space around them, the unspoken destruction hanging in the air between them. "Before the transition, a diplomatic word for what he planned. I'll need full access to all floors," Elias said, pulling his tablet from his briefcase. "My team will be conducting structural assessments this week. We'll work around your schedule when possible, but the timeline is aggressive." Clara's expression didn't change. No protest. No plea, but something in the set of her shoulders suggested a stone settling deeper into earth. "Of course," she said. "I'll stay out of your way." She turned then, moving back toward the stacks with a grace that reminded him of smoke, of water, of things that couldn't be held. Elias watched her go, cataloging the observation clinically, the way he would note the grain of wood or the angle of light through a window, and then dismissed her from his thoughts entirely. He had work to do. The day proceeded in measurements and calculations. Elias moved through rooms with the focus of a surgeon, seeing not what was, but what could be. He turned a corner and found her again. Clara sat at a desk half buried in books, her cardigan sleeves pushed to her elbows, one hand holding a magnifying glass over a page so old it looked like it might exhale into dust. Morning light fell across her workspace in golden bars, and for a moment Elias couldn't look away from the way her fingers moved. Careful, reverent, as though the pages beneath them held the only truth worth knowing. She glanced up, met his eyes through her glasses, and something in her expression made his throat tighten inexplicably. "Finding anything valuable?" he asked, immediately regretting the question's implied dismissiveness. "That depends," Clara said quietly, "on how you define value." The words carried no judgment, but they landed like an accusation nonetheless. Elias left without responding. That night, alone in his penthouse, he should have been reviewing structural reports. Instead, he found himself pulling up the security footage from the library, a routine check, he told himself, ensuring his equipment was secure, and watching a silent video of Clara Hayes turning pages in the dust. The footage was black and white, grainy, utterly mundane. He watched it for 11 minutes before closing his laptop with more force than necessary. But sleep, when it came, was restless, and in the spaces between dreams, he kept seeing ink-stained fingers moving across ancient paper, as though writing something he desperately needed to read. The forced collaboration began on a Tuesday that tasted of rain. Elias had called the meeting to discuss preservation, priorities, a phrase that meant deciding which architectural elements could be photographed before being destroyed. He expected 30 minutes of sentiment, then efficiency could resume. Clara arrived with leather-bound volumes, rolled documents, and an expression that suggested she'd been preparing for this battle since birth. The next 2 hours became a strange dance of conflict. She defended every detail with histories and stories. He countered with budgets and timelines. She saw irreplaceable beauty. He saw inefficiency dressed in nostalgia. The periodical room's Morris wallpaper, only 4 surviving examples in the hemisphere, she explained, could be sectioned for donation, he decided. The hand-carved oak paneling from 1887, 3 years of an artisan's life, water-damaged, not salvageable, he concluded. "Everything is salvageable if you care enough to try," she said quietly, and the words hung between them like a challenge, but something unexpected was happening beneath their disagreement. Elias found himself listening longer than necessary when she explained the provenance of a stained glass window, found his gaze catching on the way she touched things, books, door frames, the circulation desk, as though every object held memories she could feel through her fingertips. Found his irritation mixing with something uncomfortably close to fascination. She was infuriating, stubborn, impractical. And when she stood in colored light from the Scottish glass she was defending, her voice soft with conviction, Elias's mouth went dry. He told himself it was the dust. After she left, he stood alone in the reading room longer than justified, watching afternoon light paint shadows across empty tables. The building settled around him with small sounds, old wood creaking, drafts whispering through cracks, a kind of breathing. He pulled out his phone and found himself photographing the room exactly as Clara had described it, capturing the angle of light, the drifting dust motes, the sense that something lived here beyond function. He deleted the photo immediately. But that evening, he returned after his team had left, claiming he needed to verify measurements. The building was locked and silent. He moved through darkness to Clara's workspace in the archives, books in careful stacks, half-drunk tea still faintly warm, reading glasses resting on an open ledger, and beside them, a mechanical pencil with teeth marks on the cap. Elias picked it up without thinking, turned it in his fingers. The gesture was absurd, touching her things like a schoolboy searching for connection. But the building was empty, and his pulse quickened at this small, foolish theft of proximity. He set it down quickly and left. 3 days later, during another contentious meeting, Clara's hair slipped from its twist and she tucked it behind her ear with ink-stained fingers. Elias lost his train of thought mid-sentence. His project manager had to repeat a question twice, Clara noticed. Their eyes met across the table, and for one suspended moment, he was certain she could see straight through him, down to the man who'd stood in her workspace in the dark, like a trespasser stealing warmth from a fire not meant for him. She looked away first, But her cheeks had colored. The meeting concluded with nothing resolved. Elias retreated to his penthouse and tried to work, but his mind kept snagging on irrelevant details. The way her voice softened when she spoke about books, the precise angle of her wrist when she wrote, the fact that she took her tea with honey, not sugar. He'd noticed the containers in her workspace, each labeled in careful script. He was losing focus, becoming inefficient. This had to stop. That night, he found a strand of her dark hair caught on his blueprint where they'd both leaned over the plans that afternoon. It must have drifted there when she'd bent to point out a structural detail, her shoulder nearly brushing his. The rational response would be to brush it away. Instead, Elias smoothed the hair carefully into the fold of the document, closed the blueprint, and filed it with the others. Somewhere in the logical architecture of his mind, a wall had developed a crack. And through that crack, something dangerous was beginning to seep. The mural wall would have to go. Elias delivered this verdict on a Thursday morning, standing in the West Gallery with his structural engineer while Clara Hayes listened with the stillness of someone watching their house burn. The plaster was failing, the engineer explained, gesturing at hairline cracks webbing across the surface. Behind the decorative layer, the brick had water damage. If they were opening up the walls anyway, it made sense to... Clara's voice cut through the technical language like a blade. No. She stood 10 feet away, arms crossed, chin lifted. Morning light from the high windows turned her into something carved from marble, unmovable, ancient, stubborn as the building itself. Elias attempted patience. Structural integrity wasn't negotiable, he explained. But Clara moved forward, one hand resting against the wall as though she could hold it up through will alone. This wasn't decorative plaster. It was a WPA mural from 1936, one of 7 surviving from 43 commissioned across the state. The history of human knowledge from cuneiform tablets to the printing press, painted by Thomas Brennan, who died 6 months after completing it. His masterpiece, his only masterpiece. And Elias wanted to destroy it because it was inconvenient. The word landed like a slap. Elias felt his voice hardening. He wanted to create a building that served the community, not preserve a museum piece that 3 people per year actually noticed. His job was progress, not sentiment. Clara's response came soft and dangerous. His job was to build things. Hers was to remember them, and she would not let him erase this. They stood facing each other in the empty gallery, and Elias felt something shifting in his chest. Anger, yes, but beneath it something more complicated. Admiration for her conviction, frustration at his own inflexibility, and underneath everything, a bone-deep awareness of her presence that made the air between them feel charged. The decision had been made, he said finally. He was sorry. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable, then nodded once. She turned and walked away, footsteps echoing across marble, and Elias stood frozen, watching her go and feeling like he'd just lost something he hadn't known he was holding. His engineer cleared his throat, waiting for confirmation to proceed. "Give me 48 hours, Elias heard himself say. That night he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed 43 floors above the city, replaying the confrontation endlessly. Clara's hand against the wall, her voice trembling with controlled emotion, the way she'd looked at him, not with anger, but with disappointment that cut deeper than rage. At 2 a.m, he got up and dressed. At 2:30, he was driving through empty streets. At 3, he stood in the West Gallery with a flashlight, examining Thomas Brennan's forgotten masterpiece. In darkness, with only his flashlight beam moving across the surface, the mural revealed itself slowly, figures emerging from shadow. A monk bent over an illuminated manuscript, a woman teaching children to read, scholars in a library that looked remarkably like this one. Their faces turned toward invisible light, hope painted in their expressions. Elias moved closer, the beam catching details he'd missed in daylight, the artist's brushwork, the way color had been layered to create depth, and there, in the corner, barely visible, a signature and date. Thomas Brennan, 1936. For those who come after. Something in Elias's chest cracked open. He stood in that silent gallery until dawn painted the windows gold, carrying with him the uncomfortable weight of understanding he hadn't wanted. Clara wasn't fighting him. She was fighting for something he'd forgotten how to see. The next morning, he arrived at her office unannounced. Clara looked up from her desk, surprise flickering across her face before closing into professional neutrality. He wanted to hire a conservator, Elias said without preamble. Someone who could assess whether the mural could be stabilized and preserved in place, and if it couldn't, whether it could be carefully removed and relocated. Clara set down her pen slowly. That would delay his timeline, she observed. Would cost money not in his budget. It would, Elias confirmed to both. She studied him with those dark eyes, searching for the catch, the compromise, the angle. Elias stood still under her scrutiny and let himself be seen. The man who'd spent 4 hours in the dark learning to look at something the way she did. The man who'd discovered that progress and preservation might not be enemies after all. Why? Clara asked finally. Because it matters, he said, to you, and therefore to the project. It was a deflection, a corporate answer. But something in Clara's expression softened nonetheless. She thanked him quietly. Elias nodded and turned to leave, but her voice stopped him at the door. She'd risen from her desk, one hand resting on books beside her laptop. Morning light caught in her hair, and Elias felt his throat tighten with that now familiar breathlessness that seemed to attack whenever she was near. She was sorry she'd called him inflexible, Clara said. He was inflexible, Elias replied. Usually. The ghost of a smile touched her mouth, the first he'd ever seen from her, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He left quickly, before she could see whatever expression had taken over his face, and spent the rest of the day unable to concentrate on anything except the memory of that almost smile. That evening, his assistant dropped a folder on his desk. The preservation consultant's preliminary assessment had arrived. She could start Monday if he approved the contract. Elias signed without reading the cost estimate, and that night, alone in his penthouse, he dreamed of a woman standing among ruins, not defeated but luminous, light pouring from her hands where she touched crumbling walls, making them whole again through nothing but will and faith. He woke with his heart racing, Clara's name on his lips, and the terrifying certainty that somewhere in the last 3 weeks he'd stopped building buildings and started trying to build something he had no blueprint for. The library began to smell like her. Elias noticed it first on a Monday morning, arriving before his crew with coffee he didn't remember buying. The scent hit him the moment he crossed the threshold. Old paper and honey tea, the faint ghost of whatever soap she used. Something clean and simple that shouldn't have been noticeable, but filled his lungs like a revelation. He found himself taking deeper breaths, lingering in doorways, inventing reasons to walk past the archives. This was pathological. He told himself it was simply awareness, a heightened sensitivity because the project had become more complicated, more personal. Clara had stopped being an obstacle and become something else, a consultant, a collaborator, a person whose opinion had started to matter in ways that made his carefully ordered life tilt sideways. But awareness didn't explain why he'd started arriving earlier each day, timing his entrance to coincide with hers, why he noticed when she changed her cardigan, gray Monday, rust-colored Wednesday, cream on Friday, why he'd memorized the rhythm of her footsteps and could identify them 3 rooms away. The pattern escalated without his permission. Wednesday, he found himself in the cataloging room asking about a structural detail he'd already confirmed with his engineer. He stood there listening to her explain load-bearing walls he understood better than she did, watching her hands gesture as she spoke, feeling his pulse hammer against his collar. Thursday, his structural plans disappeared. He spent 20 minutes searching before discovering them on Clara's desk, where he'd apparently left them that morning during a conversation he barely remembered having. She'd placed a book on top to keep them from rolling, a volume of poetry he pretended not to notice while retrieving his documents. Friday, she gave him a handwritten note. She'd found a reference to the foundation work from 1887. Clara explained, appearing at his makeshift office. A municipal archive entry about reinforcement techniques that might help with his basement renovation approach. Elias took the paper with fingers that had forgotten how to function normally. Her handwriting was precise and lovely, the kind of careful script that came from someone who understood the permanent nature of words. He thanked her, said he'd look into it. Clara smiled, actually smiled, something real, and left him standing there holding a piece of paper that felt like a secret love letter. He read the note 4 times. Verified the archive reference. Used the information to avoid a foundation issue that would have cost $40,000. Then he folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his wallet, where it rested against his credit cards and driver's license like a talisman. For the rest of the day, he was aware of it, a small weight that anchored him, that made him reach to touch his pocket every time Clara entered the room, as though the note were a physical connection between them. This was beyond pathological. This was madness. That weekend, Elias tried to reset himself. Went to his gym, pushing through sets until his muscles screamed. Had dinner with his brother, who talked about his family, while Elias nodded and thought about ink-stained fingers. Attempted to work on other projects, and found his mind wandering to the library, to dust motes in sunlight, to the quiet way Clara's voice wrapped around words like she was handling something precious. Sunday night. He stood at his penthouse window and admitted what he'd been denying for weeks. He was thinking about her constantly. Not professionally, not collaboratively. Obsessively. Monday morning arrived like a test he hadn't studied for. Elias dressed with more care than usual, then changed his shirt twice before settling on the first one, disgusted with himself. He arrived at the library at 7:15 and found Clara already there. Of course, because she treated this place like home. They exchanged good mornings, and his voice came out wrong, too aware, too warm, revealing too much. Clara's expression shifted, something uncertain flickering across her face. She asked if everything was all right. Fine, Elias lied. He wanted to discuss the preservation timeline, if she had a moment. He didn't want to discuss timelines. He wanted to memorize the exact shade of her eyes behind those glasses, wanted to know if her hair was as soft as it looked. Wanted to understand how someone could be simultaneously unremarkable and utterly devastating. How this small woman in oversized cardigans had somehow become the axis around which his entire world now turned, they talked about. Schedules and materials and consultant reports, and underneath every professional word ran a current Elias couldn't name, but felt in his bones. The way Clara's fingers drummed against her desk when she was thinking. The half-second pause before she spoke, as though weighing each word. The moment their eyes met and held a beat too long, and the way she looked away first, a faint color rising in her cheeks. She felt it too. The realization hit him like vertigo. Whatever this was, this awareness, this pull, this constant hum of her presence in his nervous system, it wasn't one-sided. She felt it too, even if she was better at hiding it. Even if she wrapped herself in professionalism and distance and all the armor that people built when they suspected something dangerous was approaching. Elias left that conversation, with his heart hammering and his hands shaking and the terrifying knowledge that he was standing at the edge of something that would change everything. That night, he didn't bother pretending to work on other projects. He pulled up the library plans and studied them with new eyes. Not as structures to be efficient, but as spaces she moved through. The archives where she spent her mornings, the reading room where afternoon light caught in her hair, the West Gallery where she'd stood defending beauty with nothing but conviction. He was redesigning his entire life around someone who'd barely touched his hand. His phone buzzed. A text from his assistant about investors wanting a meeting Thursday, pushing for a faster timeline. Elias stared at the message, thinking about deadlines and budgets and the career he'd built on ruthless efficiency, thinking about how none of it mattered, as much as the fact that Clara Hayes had smiled at him, once really smiled, and he would burn every blueprint he'd ever drawn just to see it again. He set down his phone without responding. And somewhere in the expensive silence of his penthouse, with the city lights glittering below like a universe that had suddenly become irrelevant, Elias Vancroft acknowledged the truth he'd been running from. He was falling, and he had no idea how to build a foundation strong enough to catch him. Clara left on a Thursday. Elias learned about the architecture conference in Portland from his project manager, not from Clara herself, which should have meant nothing and instead felt like a wound. The archivist would be back Monday, his PM reported during their morning briefing. She'd left contact information for emergencies. Shouldn't affect their schedule at all. Shouldn't affect anything. Elias nodded, made appropriate comments about timelines and deliverables, and spent the rest of the meeting acutely aware of the library's sudden wrongness. The quality of air had changed. The light fell differently. The entire building felt like a stage after the actors had departed. Technically functional, but fundamentally empty. He tried to work. God, he tried. But without Clara's presence as a fixed point, his concentration dissolved like sugar in water. He stood in the reading room with his tablet and saw only the space where she usually sat, walked past the archives and felt the absence like a phantom limb. His crew noticed. He caught them exchanging glances, concern mixing with confusion, because Elias Vancroft didn't get distracted. Elias Vancroft was a machine of efficiency, except machines didn't feel their ribs constrict every time they rounded a corner expecting to see someone who wasn't there. By Friday afternoon, he'd reached a level of dysfunction that would have been laughable if it wasn't so devastating. He drove to the train station telling himself he needed to check on a different project nearby. A lie so transparent he didn't bother maintaining it even in his own head. The station bustled with travelers. Elias stood near the Portland platform, watching passengers board, and told himself this was insane. He was a grown man, a successful architect. He had no business haunting a train station like some lovesick teenager hoping to catch a glimpse of there. Clara emerged from the crowd, pulling a small suitcase, a messenger bag slung across her body. She wore jeans and a dark coat he'd never seen before, her hair down for once, and the sight of her stopped Elias's breath in his throat. She didn't see him. She was looking at her phone, frowning slightly, distracted by whatever message had arrived. The crowd flowed around her like water around a stone, and Elias stood frozen 30 feet away, paralyzed by the intensity of what he was feeling. Relief that she was real, that she existed beyond the library walls. Hunger to close the distance between them. Fear that if he spoke, if he revealed that he'd driven here with no purpose except to see her leave, she would understand exactly how far gone he was. Clara looked up. Their eyes met across the crowd. For a moment that stretched and contracted like elastic, neither of them moved. Elias watched recognition bloom on her face, surprise, confusion, something else he couldn't name. And then her expression shifted into something careful. She started toward him. Panic surged through Elias's system. He wasn't ready. Didn't have a story prepared. Had no explanation for why he was standing in a train station, watching her like some stalker from a tragic novel. She asked what he was doing here when she stopped 3 feet away, close enough that he could smell her perfume, far enough that the distance felt insurmountable. He lied about having a meeting nearby. About just leaving. Obviously leaving. Clara studied him with those dark eyes that saw too much, and Elias felt stripped bare under her gaze. She knew, she had to know. No one with her intelligence could miss the way he'd become a disaster in her absence, the way his whole body had oriented toward her the moment she appeared, the way he was struggling to breathe normally just from standing this close. She mentioned Portland, the conference, her return on Monday. Her tone suggested she didn't believe his meeting excuse at all. Elias said he knew, then immediately regretted it, because how would he know? How would he have any reason to track her schedule? And now she was looking at him with that expression that was part concern and part something else that made his pulse hammer. The train announcement cut through the station. Final boarding call for Portland. Clara glanced toward the platform, then back at Elias, and something vulnerable crossed her face before she locked it away. She said she should go. Elias agreed, except his feet weren't moving, and neither were hers. They stood in the current of travelers, an island of stillness, and Elias felt time contracting around them. He wanted to say something, wanted to explain that the library had felt hollow without her, that he'd been walking through spaces looking for her ghost, that she'd somehow become essential to his ability to function. But every possible sentence revealed too much. He managed to wish her a good conference. Clara's smile was small and sad as she thanked him. told him to have a good weekend. She turned and walked toward the platform, and Elias stood watching until she disappeared into the train. Stood there as the train pulled away, stood there until a station employee asked if he needed help, and Elias realized he'd been standing motionless for 7 minutes, staring at empty tracks like they held answers. He drove back to his penthouse in a fugue state. Saturday and Sunday passed in a blur of false productivity. He tried to work on other projects and ended up staring at screens without seeing them. Tried to exercise and quit halfway through. Tried to sleep and lay awake thinking about Clara in Portland. Clara at a conference. Clara existing in the world without him. And the thought felt like drowning. This wasn't normal. This wasn't healthy. This was obsession dressed in business casual, and Elias had no idea how to stop it, because stopping would mean not feeling this way about Clara Hayes, and somehow, somewhere, her presence had become the only thing that made his carefully constructed life feel like living. Monday morning arrived with the mercy of routine. Elias dressed, drank coffee, drove to the library with his heart beating too fast with the excitement of seeing her again. She would be back today. The building would be complete again. He arrived at 8 and found her already at her desk, of course, because she loved this place more than sleep. Clara looked up with a smile that hit him like electricity. She told him good morning, mentioned the conference had been excellent, described a new archival technique she'd learned. Then she said she'd met a preservation architect from Seattle who had interesting thoughts about integrating modern systems into historic structures. She'd taken notes, thought they might be useful for his approach here. She was offering him information, sharing her weekend, speaking to him with an openness that felt like an invitation. And Elias stood in her doorway struggling to form coherent thoughts because the relief of her presence was so overwhelming it had short-circuited his brain. He managed to say that was helpful, to thank her. Clara's smile widened slightly, and then she did something that destroyed him completely. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. She'd found it in a bookshop there, she explained, a first edition of a book on Gothic Revival architecture. She remembered he'd mentioned working on a church restoration early in his career, and she trailed off, suddenly uncertain, as though she'd realized the intimacy of remembering details about his life, of thinking of him while she was away, of buying him something that acknowledged she'd been listening when he spoke. Elias took the package with hands that had forgotten how to be steady. She'd bought him a book, he said, his voice strange. It wasn't expensive or anything, Clara said quickly. Just, she saw it and thought of him. I saw it and thought of you. The words hung between them like a confession, and Elias looked at this small woman with ink-stained fingers who'd just admitted that she thought of him when he wasn't there, who'd carried a book across state lines because it reminded her of him, who was looking at him now with an expression that was simultaneously shy and hopeful and terrified. He thanked her, the words carrying everything he couldn't say. He left before he could do something catastrophic, returned to his makeshift office and unwrapped the book with fingers that trembled. Inside the front cover, Clara had written in her careful script, "For EV," because progress doesn't have to mean forgetting. Elias stared at those initials. Her initials beside his, connected by intention, permanent in ink, and felt something in his chest crack open completely. She'd thought of him. In another city, in another context, separate from the library and the project and all the professional reasons they had to share space, Clara Hayes had thought about him. He pressed his thumb against her handwriting as though he could absorb the gesture through his skin. That afternoon, he authorized a budget increase he couldn't fully justify. Additional funding for the archives, for climate control systems that would protect the collection long after the renovation was complete. His CFO would question it. His investors would push back. He signed the approval anyway, and when he delivered it to Clara's office, watching her eyes widen as she read the numbers, seeing the way her hand came up to cover her mouth in surprise, Elias knew he would have authorized twice as much just to see that expression. Clara asked why he was doing this, her voice uncertain. Because it's the right thing to do, Elias said, which was technically true, even if the future he was investing in had nothing to do with buildings and everything to do with the woman standing in front of him. but Clara was watching him with those two perceptive eyes, processing details the way she did with her books, building connections, reading between lines, understanding dawning in her expression like sunrise. She started to say something formal, using his last name, but Elias interrupted with a word that escaped before he could stop it. His first name. He told her to call him Elias. The shift in the air between them was immediate and undeniable. First names changed things. First names suggested a relationship beyond professional courtesy, beyond architect and archivist, beyond the roles they'd been hiding in. Clara said his name, testing it, and the sound of it in her voice made his throat constrict. She said they should talk about... His phone rang. Elias wanted to ignore it, wanted to throw it through a window, but years of conditioning made him glance at the screen, and the name there made his stomach sink. His lead investor, calling about timeline concerns, about budget questions, about all the practical realities that existed outside this library, and the impossible thing growing between him and a woman who made him forget why any of it mattered. He apologized, said he had to take the call. Clara nodded, but something had shifted in her expression. A door closing, a wall rebuilding. When he returned to Clara's office 10 minutes later, she was gone. The book she'd given him sat on his desk that evening, and Elias opened it to random pages, trying to focus on architecture and history. But his eyes kept drifting to her inscription, her handwriting, the evidence that he existed in her thoughts when he wasn't there. He pulled out his phone and started typing a message, then deleted it. Started again. Deleted again. Thank you for the book was too casual. I can't stop thinking about you was too honest. I went to the train station Friday because I needed to see you, even just for a moment. Even though it makes no sense, was too much truth for either of them to survive. In the end, he sent nothing. But that night, alone in his penthouse with the city lights sprawling below, Elias admitted something he'd been denying, since the moment Clara Hayes had emerged from between shelves like something the building itself had conjured. He was in love with her, completely, helplessly, devastatingly in love, and he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. The storm arrived on a Tuesday with the fury of something personal. Elias was in a meeting downtown when the weather alert came through. Severe thunderstorms, flash flood warnings, power outages expected. His first thought, immediate and instinctive, was the library. His second thought was Clara. He ended the meeting early, ignoring his colleagues' protests, and drove through rain that turned streets into rivers. The city's drainage system was overwhelmed within minutes. Traffic lights flickered and died. The library sat in a low-lying district, and Elias knew, with the kind of certainty that bypassed logic, that Clara would be there, trying to save what she could, refusing to abandon the building even as water rose. He wasn't wrong. The library's entrance was locked, but light glowed from the upper windows. Elias used his contractor key with hands made clumsy by urgency, water streaming from his hair, his expensive suit plastered to his skin. Clara! His voice echoed through the foyer. The basement level was already flooding. He could hear water rushing through old pipes, the groan of a building under siege. The main floor was dry, but moisture crept up through floorboards, and the air tasted of electricity and panic. He found her in the archives. Clara stood on a chair, pulling boxes from the highest shelves, her movements frantic but controlled. Water was seeping up from below, darkening the carpet in spreading pools. Boxes of irreplaceable documents surrounded her, some already on tables, others waiting, and Clara moved between them like a general coordinating a retreat. "What are you doing here?" she demanded when she saw him, not pausing in her work. "Helping," Elias said, shrugging out of his soaked suit jacket. "Where do you need me?" "The ground floor reading room," Clara said, already turning back to the shelves. "There are materials there that can't get wet. Start moving everything to the second floor desks." You'll handle nothing alone," Elias interrupted. "Tell me what to move." For a moment, Clara looked like she might argue. Then another crash of thunder shook the building, the lights flickered, and something in her expression cracked. "Everything," she said. Everything we can reach. They worked in synchronized chaos. Elias had never done physical labor like this. His work happened in offices, on computers, in meetings where buildings rose from blueprints without him ever touching brick or mortar. But here, now he lifted boxes until his shoulders burned, hauled furniture, carried armloads of books up narrow stairs while rain hammered the roof and the building groaned around them. Clara moved through the disaster with a kind of desperate grace. She knew exactly what to prioritize. Her cardigan was soaked through. Her hair had escaped its twist entirely, and there was a smudge of dust across her cheek that Elias wanted to wipe away with his thumb. They didn't speak. There was no time for words, but when they passed each other on the stairs, Clara descending as Elias climbed, their bodies forced close in the narrow space, their eyes met, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with the storm, understanding, partnership, recognition. The power failed completely around 9 o'clock. Emergency lighting kicked in, casting everything in harsh angles and deep shadows. The basement was lost. Elias could hear water rushing through rooms they'd already abandoned. But the ground floor was holding, and everything precious had been moved higher. That's all we can do, Clara said finally, leaning against a reading table in the dim light. She was trembling, from cold or adrenaline or exhaustion. Elias couldn't tell. He crossed to her without thinking, pulled off his dress shirt, leaving only his undershirt, and draped it around her shoulders. Clara looked up at him, startled, and in the emergency lighting, her eyes were enormous. "You're soaked, too." "I run warm," Elias lied. He was freezing. Didn't care. They stood there in the darkness, surrounded by rescued archives, listening to the storm rage outside. The building settled around them with sounds that suggested damage they couldn't yet assess, but everything that mattered, everything that could be saved, was safe. "Thank you," Clara said quietly, "for coming. You didn't have to. I had to," Elias thought. "The moment I heard about the storm, I had to make sure you were safe. I would have driven through worse. I would have torn the doors off if they'd been locked, because the thought of you here alone, trying to save this place by yourself, was unbearable. It's my project," he said instead. "My responsibility." Clara's smile was small and sad. "Is that what this is? Responsibility?" The question hung between them, loaded with meaning that had nothing to do with construction contracts or renovation timelines. Elias looked at this woman wearing his shirt, her hair wild from the storm, dust streaking her face, exhaustion pulling at her features, and thought she'd never been more beautiful. "No," he admitted. "It's not responsibility. Then what is it?" Elias opened his mouth to answer, to say what he didn't know, because the truth was too large and too terrifying. But Clara gasped suddenly, her attention snapping past him. "The mural," she breathed. She pushed past him, moving toward the West Gallery, and Elias followed. The renovation work there had opened up walls, and now water was running down through the exposed brickwork, streaming across the floor toward the section where Thomas Brennan's masterpiece waited. Clara let out a sound of pure distress. "We can't lose it," she said, already moving forward. "Not after everything— Oh, wait," Elias caught her arm. "The floor's unstable. We need to—" But Clara wasn't listening. She pulled free and stepped carefully across the wet floor, reaching for the mural, and Elias's heart stopped because he could see the floorboards bowing under her weight, could imagine them giving way, could see her falling. He moved without thinking, crossed the unstable floor and grabbed Clara around the waist, pulling her back just as the section she'd been standing on gave a warning creak. They stumbled backward together, Elias's arms wrapped around her, Clara's back pressed against his chest, both of them breathing hard. "That was stupid," Elias said into her hair, and his voice came out rough. "That was incredibly stupid, and you could have been hurt." Clara was shaking. "The mural is not worth your life," Elias interrupted fiercely. "Nothing in this entire building is worth your life. Do you understand me?" "Nothing." Clara twisted in his arms to face him, and they were suddenly very close. Close enough that Elias could count her eyelashes, could see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes, could feel the rise and fall of her breathing. "It matters," she whispered. You matter more, Elias said, and the words came out like a confession. God help me, Clara, you matter more. Her breath caught. Elias, I went to the train station, he interrupted, because if he was confessing, he might as well confess everything. Friday, I didn't have a meeting. I went because I needed to see you, even though it made no sense, even though I had no reason, because the library felt empty without you and I. He stopped, breathing hard, terrified and liberated in equal measure. Clara's hand came up, resting against his chest where his heart was hammering. I bought you that book on the first day, she said quietly. I saw it and thought of you immediately, but it took me the whole conference to work up the courage to actually give it to you. They stared at each other in the darkness, while the storm raged outside and water dripped somewhere in the distance. Elias was acutely aware of his hand still resting on her waist, of her palm pressed against his racing heart, of the way the emergency lighting carved shadows across her face and made her look like something from a dream. This is complicated, Clara whispered. I know. You're my client. I'm your consultant. There are professional boundaries. I know, Elias said again. But I can't stop thinking about you, Clara continued, and her voice cracked slightly. I tried. After the train station, after the book, I told myself I was imagining things, reading too much into gestures. But then you authorized that budget and looked at me like you're the only thing I see when I walk into a room, Elias finished. Like I've forgotten what it feels like to care about anything that isn't making you smile. Like I would tear down every building I've ever designed if it meant keeping you safe. Clara's eyes filled with tears. Elias. His name in her voice, soft and wondering, broke something in him. He lifted one hand from her waist, slowly, giving her every chance to stop him, and brushed his thumb across the smudge of dust on her cheek. Her skin was impossibly soft. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. I don't know how to be this person who feels this much. But you've changed everything. You've changed me, and I don't want to go back to who I was before. Clara's hand pressed harder against his heart, as though she could feel every beat, every admission his body was making that his words couldn't fully capture. I don't want you to go back, she whispered. They stood there in the damaged gallery, surrounded by water and ruin and rescued beauty, and something between them shifted irrevocably. Not a kiss. They both knew that would cross a line they weren't ready for, but something deeper. An acknowledgement. A promise. Clara Hayes and Elias Vancroft, standing in the wreckage of a storm, recognizing each other completely. We should check the rest of the building, Clara said finally, though she didn't move away. We should, Elias agreed, not moving either. Eventually, slowly they separated, but when they walked through the darkened library assessing damage, their hands brushed, and neither pulled away. When they climbed the stairs to check the upper floors, Elias's hand rested briefly, protectively, on the small of Clara's back. When they finally sat on the second-floor landing, exhausted and waiting for the storm to pass, Clara leaned against his shoulder. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Outside, the storm began to ease, and inside the library that had brought them together, surrounded by the books and histories Clara loved, and the structure Elias had learned to see through her eyes, something new was being built. Something that had no blueprint. Something that terrified and thrilled them both. Something that felt, against all logic and reason, exactly right. The discovery happened on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the storm. Elias was overseeing water damage restoration in the West Gallery when his structural engineer called him over with an expression that meant either disaster or miracle. The water had loosened a section of plaster, and beneath it, hidden for decades, lay another mural. Not Thomas Brennan's 1936 masterpiece, that was safe, protected. This was something older. Elias moved closer, his flashlight catching fragments of color and form, angels or saints, their faces serene, painted directly onto the original brick. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each brushstroke visible, each detail rendered with devotion rather than mere skill. Late 19th century, the engineer estimated. Probably original to the building's 1887 construction, hidden under plaster for at least 60 years. Elias stared at the emerging artwork and felt the weight of decision settling on his shoulders. The renovation plans called for this entire wall section to be removed. It was structurally compromised, sitting directly in the path of necessary mechanical systems. The wall could come down, systems could be installed, a new wall built. It was the logical choice, the efficient choice, the choice he would have made without hesitation 6 months ago. But that was before Clara Hayes had taught him to see differently. He asked about the cost of working around it. His engineer pulled up plans. They'd have to reroute the entire HVAC system, move ductwork to the north corridor, shift the mechanical room. The timeline would extend 3 months minimum. Cost-wise, $400,000, maybe $5. Elias pulled out his phone and photographed the mural, sent the images to Clara with a simple message asking her to come to the West Gallery. She arrived within 5 minutes, slightly breathless, and stopped dead when she saw the exposed artwork. The sound she made was pure reverence, a soft exhalation that held wonder and recognition and something close to prayer. This was the original chapel mural, Clara explained, her voice filled with awe. The library had been built on the site of a small church. She'd found references in the archives. The congregation couldn't afford maintenance, so they sold the land to the city. Historical records mentioned beautiful paintings, but she'd assumed they'd been destroyed, never thought they'd been here the whole time, hidden, waiting in darkness for decades. She reached out, stopping just short of touching the wall, her fingers trembling. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she didn't wipe them away. Elias looked at Clara crying over century-old paint, at his engineer waiting for a decision, at the renovation plans that represented millions of dollars and the career he'd built on making practical choices. They were preserving it, he said. His engineer's eyebrows shot up, citing the cost, the delays, the investors' existing concerns. But Elias repeated himself with finality. Reroute the systems, adjust the timeline. Whatever it takes, this would preserve something irreplaceable. Make it work. The engineer nodded and left, already pulling out his phone. Clara turned to Elias, tears still wet on her face. He'd just added months to his timeline, she said. Hundreds of thousands to his budget. The investors would... Let me worry about the investors, Elias interrupted. His career would survive. That mural wouldn't, and he couldn't destroy it. Not anymore. Not after she'd taught him to see what they lost, when they chose efficiency over beauty. Clara was looking at him with an expression that made his chest tighten. Wonder and gratitude and something deeper that he didn't dare name. She asked when he'd become this person. When I met you, Elias thought. When you stood in front of me and refused to let me erase history. When you made me understand that progress and preservation aren't enemies. When you became the lens through which I see everything differently. Still figuring that out, he said instead. But Clara was smiling through her tears. And Elias thought he would gladly add years to the timeline, millions to the budget, if it meant seeing that expression on her face. The investor meeting happened the following Tuesday. Elias sat at a sleek conference table 40 floors above the city and watched 6 people in expensive suits review the updated timeline and budget, with expressions ranging from concerned to furious. This was unacceptable, the lead investor said finally. They were already 3 months behind schedule. These additional delays put the entire financial model at risk. The building was structurally sound, Elias countered. The delays related to preservation efforts that would ultimately increase the property's cultural value. Cultural value doesn't pay returns, another investor snapped. They hadn't invested in a museum project. They'd invested in a profitable renovation. Elias reminded them quietly that they'd invested in his expertise. And his expertise said that destroying irreplaceable historical elements would damage the building's long-term value, both financially and culturally. Your expertise used to prioritize efficiency, the lead investor observed. My expertise has evolved. Elias replied. The investor leaned back, studying Elias with shrewd eyes. He'd changed since taking on this project, the man said. His other developments were languishing because he was spending all his time at that library. His decision-making had become erratic, and now he was asking them to approve cost overruns that could sink their margins. Elias asked them to trust that he knew what he was doing. "Do you?" the investor asked sharply, "because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've lost perspective." Elias thought about Clara's hand against his chest during the storm. Thought about her tears over hidden murals and her dedication to preserving beauty that most people wouldn't notice. Thought about how his entire life had felt like a series of glass boxes until she'd shown him there was more. More meaning, more purpose, more reason to care about the spaces people inhabited. "Maybe I have lost perspective," Elias admitted. "Or maybe I've finally gained it." The meeting ended badly. 2 investors threatened to pull funding. The others demanded weekly progress reports and budget reviews. The lead investor made it clear that any further delays or overruns would result in Elias being removed from the project entirely. Elias left that meeting knowing he'd just put everything at risk: his reputation, his career, the financial security he'd spent 15 years building. He went directly to the library, found Clara in the archives, surrounded by documents, and she looked up when he entered with an expression that suggested she already knew. She asked how bad it was. "Bad," Elias admitted, sinking into the chair across from her desk. They were considering replacing him on the project. Clara's face went pale. "No," she said. "He couldn't lose this because of—" "I'm not losing anything," Elias interrupted gently. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." "But his career," Clara protested. "Would survive or it wouldn't," Elias replied. "But either way, he'd be able to live with the person he saw in the mirror. He was doing this because it was right, because she'd taught him that some things mattered more than profit margins." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, and Elias watched her struggle for composure, watched her hands grip the edge of her desk like she needed something solid to hold on to. "I'm falling in love with you," she whispered. The words hit Elias like a physical impact, stealing his breath, stopping his heart, rewriting every assumption he'd made about what was possible between them. "She knew it was complicated," Clara continued quickly. "Knew the project wasn't finished, and there were professional boundaries, and 100 reasons why this was a bad idea. But she couldn't keep pretending. Not when he was risking everything for something she cared about. Not when he looked at her like she was, like you're the only thing that matters," Elias finished, his voice raw. "Because you are. God help me, Clara, you are." He stood, and she stood, and they met in the middle of her office, surrounded by books and history and all the things she'd spent her life protecting. Elias lifted his hand to her face, cupping her cheek, and Clara leaned into the touch like she'd been starving for it. "I love you," he said, and the words felt like jumping off a building, terrifying and liberating and inevitable. "I think I've loved you since the moment you defended that mural with nothing but conviction. You've become the center of everything, the reason I wake up, the reason any of this matters." Clara's hand covered his where it rested against her cheek. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We finish the project," Elias said. "We save this building the right way, and then we figure out the rest." "That's simple?" Clara asked. "Nothing about this is simple," Elias admitted, "but everything worth having is complicated." They stood there in the quiet archives, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, and Elias felt something in his chest unlock completely. All the walls he'd built, all the control he'd maintained, all the careful distance he'd kept from feeling too much, gone, demolished, rebuilt into something better. Clara. Hayes had taken a man who measured life in blueprints and taught him that the most important things couldn't be designed, only discovered, only lived, only loved. "3 months later, the library was almost complete. A perfect marriage of modern vision and historical devotion that represented the best work Elias had ever done. But the project was ending. And with it, the professional framework that had contained what was growing between them. They'd been careful, scrupulously professional in public. Only in stolen moments did they allow themselves honesty. A touch of hands when passing documents, Conversations that lasted too long about nothing important, the way Clara would lean against his shoulder when they reviewed plans. But they hadn't defined what this was. The unspoken agreement was to wait until the project ended, until professional complications resolved, until they could figure out how to be together without risking everything. The waiting was killing him. Friday evening, the crew departed early for the weekend. The library sat in golden autumn light, almost ready for its grand reopening in 2 weeks. Elias stood in the main reading room reviewing punch list items and feeling the weight of endings pressing down on his chest. Clara appeared in the doorway holding 2 paper cups of tea. They'd both thought the other had left, spotted the other's car still there. She handed him tea. Honey, no sugar, because she'd memorized how he took it. And they stood side by side, looking at the space they'd fought over, compromised on, ultimately created together. "It's beautiful," Clara said softly. "It is," Elias agreed. They drank their tea in comfortable silence, the building settling around them with small sounds, as though satisfied with its transformation. "Come with me," Elias said suddenly. "There's something I want to show you." He led her through the building, up narrow stairs to the tower access, a door that had been locked for decades. Elias had convinced the city to preserve it. The spiral staircase had been reinforced, the dome restored, and now they emerged into the tower's upper room, and Clara gasped. The space was small and circular, ringed with Gothic windows that looked out over the city. Evening light poured in, painting everything gold and amber. Below them, the city sprawled in all directions, and above, the sky deepened toward evening. Clara moved to the windows, breathless. She hadn't known this was accessible, she said. "It wasn't," Elias replied, "until this week. He'd had his crew finish the work yesterday." Clara turned to look at him, something in her expression making his pulse stutter. "Why?" she asked. "Because you mentioned once that you'd always wondered what the view was like from here," Elias said quietly. "It was in passing, months ago, and he wanted her to see it." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "He remembered that," she said. "I remember everything you say," Elias replied. Everything. The way she took her tea. That her favorite color changed with the seasons. That she got ink stains on her left hand because she was right-handed, but rested her hand on paper when she wrote. That she read poetry when anxious. That she— "Elias," Clara interrupted, her voice shaking. "What are we doing?" The question hung between them in the golden light, and Elias knew they'd reached the edge of something. A moment that would define everything that came after. He crossed to her slowly, giving her time to stop him, to step back, to maintain the distance they'd been so careful to preserve. She didn't move. "What do you want?" he asked when he stood before her, close enough to see the gold flecks in her eyes, close enough to feel the shallow catch of her breathing. "I want this project to be finished, so I can stop pretending I don't love you," Clara whispered. "I want to figure out how to be together without compromising everything I've built. I want to stop being careful and just—" Her voice broke. "I want to stop being afraid." "Of what?" Elias asked. "That this isn't real," Clara said, tears spilling over. "That I've built you up in my head into something impossible. That when the project ends and we don't have the library between us anymore, you'll realize I'm just me. Someone ordinary who cares too much about old books and dead artists." Elias lifted his hand to her face, catching tears with his thumb. "You think you're ordinary?" he said. "Compared to you," Clara began. "Clara," his voice was rough with emotion. "You rewrote my entire life. You took someone who saw the world in measurements and angles and taught him to see beauty. You made me want to be better. Not more successful, not more accomplished, but fundamentally better as a human being." He stopped, struggling to find adequate words. "You're the first thing I think about when I wake up," he continued. "The reason I drive to this library before I should. The person whose opinion matters more than investors or profits or my entire career. I would tear down every building I've ever designed if it meant making you smile. You are not ordinary. You are extraordinary, and I'm terrified." His voice cracked. "I've never felt this way about anyone," Elias admitted. "I don't know how to do this. I've built empires of glass and steel, but I have no blueprint for loving someone the way I love you." "Afraid of building something you can't control?" Clara finished softly. Yes, Elias said. Clara's hand came up to rest over his heart, where it always seemed to find its home. I'm afraid too, she said. Of what? Elias asked. That I'll never be enough, Clara whispered. That my world is too small for someone who builds cities. That eventually you'll realize you gave up too much for someone who taught me that preservation isn't weakness, Elias interrupted fiercely. Who showed me that the things worth saving are the things we can't replace. Who made me understand that home isn't a structure you build, it's a person you return to. He took her face in both hands, holding her gently, looking into her eyes with every ounce of honesty he possessed. You are my home, Clara Hayes, he said, and his voice shook. Not this library, not any building I'll ever design. You, the way you see the world, the way you make me see it, the way you touch things like they matter, the way you look at me like I could be everything. Clara's hands came up to cover his where they held her face. I don't need you to be perfect, she said. I just need you to be honest, to keep seeing the world this way, our way, to keep caring about things that matter. To love you, Elias finished. That's easy. That's the easiest thing I've ever done. The loving you part is effortless. The admitting it, the risking everything, the not knowing how this ends, that's terrifying. But the loving you, that feels like breathing. Clara laughed, the sound wet and joyful. And Elias wanted to memorize this moment. The golden light, the sound of her happiness, the way she looked at him like he'd given her something precious when all he'd done was tell the truth. They stayed in the tower until night fell completely, talking quietly about futures and possibilities, about how they'd navigate the next 2 weeks, about the life they'd build together once professional complications resolved. It wouldn't be simple. Clara's work was here. Elias's career took him across the city, wherever buildings needed his vision. They'd have to negotiate distance and time and practical realities. But standing there with her hand in his, her head resting against his shoulder, Elias felt certain of something he'd never been certain of before. They'd figure it out, because some things were worth fighting for. Worth rearranging your life for, worth choosing even when the path forward wasn't clear. And Clara Hayes, with her quiet strength and fierce dedication, and the way she saw beauty where others saw obsolescence, was worth everything. The library reopened on a Saturday in October, when autumn light fell across stone and glass like a blessing. The ceremony celebrated not just architectural achievement, but the marriage between past and future. The mayor gave speeches, the Historical Society presented awards. Donors and investors mingled with community members who'd fought for the building's survival. Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, watching Clara give a tour to children. She moved through the restored reading room with reverence, explaining the Morris wallpaper and Victorian crown molding, pointing out the Brennan mural and the chapel mural they'd discovered hidden beneath plaster. The children listened with rapt attention. The kind children gave to people who truly loved what they spoke about. Watching her with those children, seeing her face light up, the gentle patience in her voice, the way she bent down to answer questions at eye level. Elias fell in love with her all over again. The lead investor approached, the one who'd threatened to pull funding. He acknowledged the beautiful work, admitted his doubts about the delays and Elias's change in approach. But the result spoke for itself. You were right, the investor said. The preservation adds value. Elias nodded, but his attention kept drifting back to Clara, showing children how art could be saved even when it seemed lost. She's remarkable, the investor observed. I understand she fought to save every historic element. She understood what this building could be better than anyone, Elias said. Including me. Especially me. People might think you've gone soft, Vancroft. Elias looked at Clara, light catching in her hair. I've gone better, he corrected quietly. Eventually, the crowd thinned. Elias found Clara in the archives, putting away materials from the day's tours. She looked up and smiled, the real smile, the one she gave him when they were alone. They discussed the successful day, then Elias pulled an envelope from his jacket. A job offer for a major museum project in Seattle, high profile, career-defining. Exactly what he used to take without hesitation. I turned it down, he said, setting it on her desk, because it would mean 6 months in Seattle. And I don't want to be in Seattle. I want to be here. He pulled out his tablet, showed her the list he'd compiled. Schools and churches, libraries and community centers across the city. Beautiful buildings being abandoned, demolished, erased, because they didn't fit modern efficiency models. He wanted to create a practice focused on preservation-minded renovation, Elias explained. Projects that honored history while making buildings functional for the future, and he was hoping she'd partner with him officially. Her historical expertise combined with his architectural background. Yes, Clara interrupted. Yes to everything. To working together. To building something new. To whatever comes next. Relief and joy flooded through Elias's chest. Was she sure? It meant they'd be working together constantly. Might get complicated. We're already complicated, Clara said. Might as well be complicated and purposeful. Elias laughed, pulling her close. When did you get so wise? I've always been wise. You just had to learn to listen. They stood there in the quiet archives, and Elias felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of completion, he'd never experienced before. This was what home felt like. Not a building, not a location. This, her, the life they were building together. They stayed until the security guard came to lock up. This library had been their beginning, the place where a man who built everything met a woman who preserved everything. And somehow, impossibly, they'd found a way to do both. The October night was cool and clear as they walked to their cars. The library rose behind them, perfectly balanced between old and new, history and progress, exactly what it should be. Same time tomorrow? Clara asked, her hand in his. Tomorrow and every day after, Elias confirmed. That night, Elias pulled out the book Clara had given him months ago, opening to her inscription, for EV. Because progress doesn't have to mean forgetting. CH. He read those words again, understanding them differently now. Progress and preservation, efficiency and beauty, logic and love. They weren't opposites. They were partners. His phone buzzed. A text from Clara. Thank you for today. For everything. For seeing this place the way I do. For becoming the kind of architect who saves things. For choosing us, Elias typed back. Thank you for teaching me to see. For refusing to let me destroy things that mattered. For saving me. Clara's response came immediately. We saved each other. Elias stood at his window for a moment, looking out at the city lights, then texted, Come back. 3 dots appeared. Then now, 20 minutes later, his doorbell rang. Clara stood there in the hallway, slightly breathless from hurrying, her hair windswept, eyes questioning. Elias pulled her inside, wrapped his arms around her, and they stood there in the entrance of his penthouse. The glass and chrome space that had once felt like a prison of his own making. I didn't want to wait until tomorrow, he said. Quietly, Clara's arms came around his waist. Neither did I. They moved to the window, the city sprawling below them in a galaxy of lights. Elias pulled her close, and Clara rested her head on his shoulder, fitting against him perfectly, the way she always had, the way he'd somehow known she would from the moment she'd emerged from between those library shelves. They stood there in comfortable silence, watching the city breathe, and Elias finally understood what he'd been building toward his entire life. Not the structures that bore his name, not the skyline he'd helped create, but this moment, this woman, this feeling of completeness that had nothing to do with achievement and everything to do with love. Clara Hayes had taught him that some foundations couldn't be measured in concrete and rebar. They were built in trust and time, in vulnerability and courage, in the willingness to let someone see you completely and love you anyway. What are you thinking? Clara asked softly, her head still resting on his shoulder. That I spent 15 years building things that touch the sky, Elias said, and none of them made me feel as grounded as you do. Clara lifted her head to look at him, her eyes soft in the dim light. That's very poetic for an architect. "I learned from the best," he said. "A woman who sees poetry in plaster and murals. Who taught me that the most important things can't be designed, only discovered." Clara smiled and settled her head back on his shoulder. "We discovered each other." "We did." They stood there as the city lights glittered below, and Elias felt his heart beating not in time with his pulse, but with hers, a rhythm no architect could ever design, but one that finally, perfectly, felt like the only structure he would ever need. Clara's hand found his, their fingers intertwining, and Elias knew that this was the blueprint that mattered, not the buildings he'd create or the cities he'd shape, but this quiet moment with the woman who'd taught him to see, who'd saved him from a life measured only in angles and efficiency, who'd shown him that home wasn't a place you built, it was a person you returned to. And standing there with Clara's head on his shoulder, her hand in his, Elias Vancroft finally understood that he'd spent his entire career constructing monuments to progress, when all along, the only thing worth building was a life with someone who made every moment feel like coming home.